Good evening, everybody. Welcome to FIU. Welcome to another event of the Institute of Cuban Studies about a topic that is in everybody's minds nowadays. My name is Sebastián Arcos. I'm the interim director of the Institute of Cuban Studies. And before we dive into our subject, I have to make a few acknowledgements. We have with us tonight the fourth president of FIU, my first boss at FIU, Dr. Modesto Maidique. And then we have with us Dr. Shlomi Dinar, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Maidique was my first boss. Shlomi is my actual boss today. We are here to discuss what's going to happen in Cuba after what happened in Venezuela on January 3rd of this year. When this panel was put together on January 4th, we only knew what had happened the day before. Things have changed since that moment. January 3rd broke the traditional assumption that the Cuban regime will continue to deteriorate for a long time until an eventual collapse or transformation. That assumption is no longer valid after January 3rd. It became very clear that the horizon that used to be in the long term was now cut to the short term. Now, the presidential executive order of January 29 changed that paradigm once again, because it signaled that the United States will no longer be a passive observer of this process of deterioration in Cuba and has now become an active agent of change that is willing to go outside of the traditional foreign policy paradigm to precipitate regime change in the very short term. So we went from years to months to perhaps weeks. The response from the Cuban regime so far is the usual rhetoric about resistance and blaming the US for a fascist and genocidal policy, et cetera, et cetera. They're asking for more sacrifices. They're saying that they will not engage in a dialogue with conditions that demand regime change, reforms, political or economic reforms, the usual speech. I believe that the Cuban regime right now is in the classic phase of denial. They cannot accept that the situation, the strategic situation has changed and that things are different from what they used to be, and they're not going back to what they used to be. So this is it's the first stage of grief. I think they are in that first stage of grief right now. In the meantime, there are rumors of negotiation in Mexico. There are rumors that US SIGINT signal intelligence planes are flying next to Cuba. It's a hurricane of rumors, what we have. So the purpose of this panel tonight is to wade through the rumors and the conspiracies and try to find out exactly what, or as close to reality as we can get. Tonight we have a stellar panel that I hope will answer most of your questions. And let me start by introducing the panel. Jorge Piñón, here, my immediate left, He's Senior Research Fellow at the University of Texas at Austin Energy Institute. He began his oil career with Shell, president of Amoco Oil of Mexico and president of Amoco Oil of Latin America. He later managed BP's Western Mediterranean petroleum supply and logistics. He is a recipient of the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies Alumni Lifetime Achievement Award. Dario Moreno, sitting next, is Associate Professor, Department of Politics and International Relations in SIPA, School of International Public Affairs. He's a nationally recognized expert in Florida and Miami politics. He was my professor, I must confess, in Cuban politics. He teaches a variety of courses, including Miami politics, Cuban politics, Florida politics, election and political parties, including co-teaching, by the way, American and international politics with some Cuban American who happens to be today the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Next to Dario Moreno, Carlos Diaz Rosillo is a recognized expert in U.S. foreign policy and Latin American affairs. He directs the Adam Smith Center for Economic Policy. He's an expert on political and security dynamics, shaping the broader Western Hemisphere. He's an expert in democratic governance, regional policy responses, previously served at senior levels of the US government, including Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Policy and Interagency Coordination at the White House, and as Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, that's a long title, for International Security Affairs. We had originally on the panel Brian Fonseca. Unfortunately, he's got the flu, so he's not going to be with us, but we found an excellent replacement in Helena Aguirre Ferre, who is now Government and Public Policy Director for the Adam Smith Center. Helen is going to make up, I think, very, very well for Brian. And then last but not least, another of my favorite professors at FIU, Eduardo Gamarra, Professor of Department of Politics and International Relations, Director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum. He's a political scientist, author, political consultant, and pollster with 4 decades of experience analyzing Latin America and Caribbean politics. With deep expertise in the Andean region, he's also recognized for his knowledge of US-Cuba relations and the evolution of US-Cuba policy. As director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at FIU, he directs the annual Latino Poll, a leading survey of Latino political attitudes and sentiment in the United States. So with that, we're going to start with the panel. We're going to engage in a conversation after they are done with their introductory comments. And then we're going to go to Q&A with the public. I ask that you please raise your hand, say your name, stand, and ask a question. We are among many Cuban Americans here, so I insist, please, a question. Thank you very much. Let's start with the panel. Jorge.
Thank you, Sebastian, for that nice introduction. It's always a pleasure to come here, especially come back to Miami, which I thought it was going to be 80, 85 degrees.
It's warmer than Texas.
I left Austin with ice in my car yesterday morning when I got up. So it was a cool surprise that I got when I landed in Miami. What I'm going to do is give you what we call situation analysis. Situation analysis is just a snapshot of the situation that we're in a particular subject or issue that we're going to discuss, so that we're all talking from the same baseline information. I'm going to break my situation analysis in 2 sectors. One is the electric power sector of Cuba, and second end is oil and the supply of oil and oil liquids and fuels for Cuba. Cuba's electric power sector is totally collapsed. There's no other word that I can find to share with you. Their units are over 40 years of age. They have had very little operating maintenance. Most important, no capital maintenance. For example, the most recent report by UNE from yesterday, 9 out of 19 generating units were out of service, and those that were installed or working only were working at about 85% of capacity. There's no Band-Aid solutions. It's a structural problem. Siemens, the Germans, and Total were in Cuba March 2018 and spent a few months kicking the tires. And their study came back and saying, it's no good. It's not even good to rebuild a power station where the existing one is today because of the environmental liabilities. Remember that they burn Cuban crude oil, which is a crude oil very high in sulfur, very heavy, very high in metals, very corrosive, which really is a vicious circle to the power plants. They fix the power plant, and then 6 weeks later, down it goes again. So the running of this crude oil has really put all of the basically 7 thermoelectric power plants in a position that environmentally nobody will touch it. It's just too rich. So we're talking about greenfield sites, not brownfield sites in the future. We estimate that it's going to take between $5 to $8 billion and anywhere between 3 to 5 years to rebuild the baseline generating capacity of Cuba, and do that this time with natural gas LNG, which is plenty of it. So that's where the electric sector power is. Now comes transmission. We always think of electricity from the generating point of view, but we forget that there has to be lines, distribution to get to the consumer. The transmission system is also down. It just happened that earlier this week, a substation in Holguín went down. Literally, a substation transformer went down. It brought with it 3 provinces down. In other words, Guantánamo, Santiago de Cuba, and Granma, all of the electric power plants in those provinces also came down with that little substation in Holguín. That will show you design flaws. That will show you really how deep is the problem of the electric power sector in Cuba throughout its value chain. Oil. Oil demand in Cuba from 2018 to 2024 has dropped about 22-24%. Cuba used to consume about 145,000 barrels a day, and the most recent figure shows about 109. What we have used for this discussion, this situation analysis, is we're going to use 100,000 barrels a day because in the last year, you had a drop in tourist trade, you have had a drop of the economy, so we brought it down to about 100,000 barrels a day of oil demand. Cuba produces 40,000 barrels a day. So very simple arithmetic, 100 less 40 gives you a deficit of 60, which is what Cuba has been going through for the last 5 years. Where is that 60,000 barrels a day coming from? Number one, Venezuela. And we all know that it's a barter agreement. I really get a little bit upset when I hear about, well, Cuba is paying for the oil. Well, it's really, it's not. It is a true barter agreement. Cuba does not pay for any oil, period. Get that through your heads. And they have Venezuela in the exchange, a barter agreement of doctors and lawyers and sports trainers and military personnel in return for the oil. That number, on average, is about 30,000 barrels a day. Another thing that we do in our situational analysis with Cuba, we take averages. The oil market, 1 month you can have 18,000 barrels come in, and the next one 70. And, no, we use monthly average, quarterly average, which is what I'm going to be sharing with you. So Venezuela, number one, about 30,000 barrels a day. Number two, all of a sudden, in the last 3 years, Mexico, with about 20,000 barrels a day of their best quality crude. Mexico has not given Cuba any of their Maya heavy, but the Olmeca, which is a very, very good crude oil, middle type of quality. Surprising that the Mexicans not only gave Cuba oil, again, we understand, irregardless of what Mexico said on Tuesday at the press conference of the president, where they said they get paid, they don't get paid. Okay, there's a company in the middle called Gasolineras Bienestar. And Gasolineras Bienestar is just a front to funnel these barrels. So Pemex might very well get paid from Gasolineras Bienestar, but I can assure you that Cuba is not paying Mexico for the oil that they're getting. And then third, to our surprise, Russia. We really thought that we were going to see a lot of Russian crude coming to Cuba. Russia is long because of the sanctions. There's a number of tankers that are floating in the Pacific looking for a home. Urals crude, which is their best crude, is selling at $16 discount of Brent. By the way, Cienfuegos was built to run Urals. And they're only sending about a cargo a quarter. We really thought that we were going to see a lot of Russian oil coming to Cuba. It hasn't. The question that I've been asked constantly for the last 2 weeks is, how many days can Cuba survive with oil? That's the key question. We don't have an answer. What we do at the Institute is that we have satellite pictures of every single tank in Cuba, not only at the refineries, but at the 8 marine oil terminals and 11 distribution facilities throughout the island. We have satellite pictures that we can show you how many tanks they have. We went to engineering and asked our good friends at engineering to calculate the diameter and the circumference of the tanks, and then where the shadow of the tank, depending on the time that the picture was taking, we can calculate then how much storage does the tank has. The problem is we don't know what the state of the tank. Is it an old tank? Is it a new tank? Where is the manifold? A lot of questions to which we don't have an answer. And then finally, there are tanks for jet fuel, there are tanks for gasoline, there are tanks for diesel, there are tanks for naphtha. We just don't have it. There was a Reuters report that they went to 8 to 10 days. Well, I don't know where that come from. All that we can tell you is that if by March you don't see an oil cargo in the horizon coming either into Havana or Cienfuegos, zero has taken place. In other words, that's it. So March is, as far as we're concerned, they dropped that date. Finally, let me finish with what do we think that a possible solution is. And I'm not the political, I'm certainly not the political expert in this table. The U.S. has a lot of oil. The U.S. has a lot of Venezuelan oil. The U.S. has 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil that Trafigura and Vitol, two companies that we know very well, are marketing on behalf of the U.S. government. So something that we have sitting on the side is that the U.S. is sitting on at least, well, they sold some, the original 50 million barrels that PDVSA had given the U.S. government. Cuba's refineries, just like the electric power sector, are old. I mean, the Exxon and Chevron and Shell refineries were built back in 1957, 58. They can't run heavy crudes anyway. So we see that as a token that the U.S. could very well have toward the Cuban government to say, these are the rules of the game, and yes, by the way, we will be able to supply you with oil. How is Cuba then going to pay the U.S. for that Venezuelan oil that the U.S. holds today? That's another question to be discussed. In summary, no surprise to this audience, the system is broken. And what's going to fix it is a change not only in the political structure of the country, but in the economic structure of the country. We were in Houston last week talking to some of the oil companies on another project that we have going on with them, and I took the opportunity to talk about Venezuela and ask them about Venezuela and ask them about Cuba. There's some risk that they're not going to take. Like Chevron said, Exxon said, we've been nationalizing Venezuela twice. I'm not going to be nationalized a third time. And this guy, what he shared with me is the Peanuts comic in which, what's her name, Lucy holds the football for Linus to kick, and then at the last minute she pulls it. And this guy said, they're not doing that to us again. So again, situation is drastic. There is no oil. They only have is the 40,000 barrels a day of heavy oil that they're going to run. So some of the thermoelectric power plants will run. But we were hearing already news that, things were running out. So
Make it. Please, you leave the recognition to the end, please, so we can move forward.
I was going to comment, I thought Cuba only had 6 provinces, but that's an old joke. What I want to lay out, I'll be brief, is what do I think are the possible scenarios of change in Cuba? I think there are, and I'll be interested from the panel if there's a 4th or a 5th. But I think there are 3, and the most the best is a negotiated transition at this point. As Sebastian and the other speaker has commented, is Cuba has been in dire financial straits since 2018. The situation is worse, much worse than during the special period. Cuba produced 150,000 tons of sugar last year. They have to export sugar to make rum. The only instrument of the healthcare system has collapsed. The road system has collapsed. The food distribution system has collapsed. The only thing that hasn't collapsed is the state apparatus of repression, which unfortunately still works. So there's a lot of incentives if you care about your citizens to enter into some sort of negotiations with the United States. But in 2016, when President Obama visited Havana, the regime was offered the best deal it was going to get, a much better deal than today, obviously. And they turned it down out of revolutionary arrogance. They wouldn't even release the political prisoners. And today, and it's funny because they do sound like the Ayatollahs in Iran. They're willing to negotiate anything except what you care about, which is, our sovereignty, our independence, our self-determination, and without interference in our internal affairs, right? So Cuba has said it's willing to talk. We'll see. I hope they are. But what also makes it difficult is that Cuba is an extremely weak diplomatic situation, because there's nothing really that the United States is going to get out of Cuba except another failed state. And we already have Haiti. Cuba has an economic crisis. The Cuban labor force is here, right? If you look at the statistics of the people coming to the United States, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly under 40, right? Cuba, besides a Russian and Chinese listening base, is not a security threat. The FAR is a ghost of itself. There are few economic resources. So they claim to have rare earth, but now everybody has rare earth. I have rare earth in my backyard, right? You know, now that we know that Trump is interested, everybody on earth now has rare earth. I would like this possibility, but I have been amazed over the last 20 years how much suffering are totalitarian regimes willing to impose on their people, whether it's Venezuela, the Ayatollahs, or Putin. And basically, these regimes have learned the lessons, the wrong lessons from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and are unwilling to give any reform because that begins the process of regime change. So my interpretation, and I hope to God I'm wrong, is that the regime will not be willing to negotiate. Hope I'm wrong. The other possible scenario is a Venezuela light, a decapitation strategy of the regime, and to find a Cuban Daisy Rodriguez who is willing to collaborate with the Americans, right on. And that could be a possibility, but Trump is risk-averse to use military force. And Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, has gold, has emeralds. Venezuela has a lot of things that Cuba doesn't have. We have Varadero, and we're selling the sand, right? The third option, which is the worst option, and thus the most likely, is a maximum pressure campaign that lasts 2 years until we collapse the regime, and that leaves us with a humanitarian crisis in Cuba. And I actually think that's the most likely scenario because of the stubbornness and intransigent of these totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. So on that happy note.
That will take 2 to 3 years. I know.
Yeah, I mean, it could, hopefully 6 months, hopefully 3 months. We don't know, but that's the, and for Trump, that's easy. There's no risk. I think like a campaign strategist, right?
Carlos?
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief so we can leave more time for Q&A and for discussion. I actually do agree that that is a fairly likely scenario, not the only one like you mentioned, but I'll say a couple of things that are probably not going to be popular. I look at this from the perspective of the U.S. as a former foreign policymaker. And one thing that I think has to be on the table is that President Trump was elected to be president of the United States to advance American interests. And therefore, the idea that he will act to promote democracy in Cuba, to advance the interests of the Cuban people, I think misses the point that that's not what he was elected to do, right? He was elected to advance American interests. And so he's going to look at this from the perspective of the president of the United States. And so if there is a direct interest, or if he sees that there is a direct interest to the United States, then I think he'll act. For months, he was saying that he will act in Venezuela, that he will intervene and take out the dictator, and nobody believed him. And, whatever you think of him, and I'm sure that there's mixed opinions, the guy, says what he thinks and does what he says. And so he said, I'm going to take him out. And Maduro said, come get me, and he did. He said that Cuba is next. I have no doubt that Cuba will be next. Is that going to be an invasion? Is that going to be a maximum pressure campaign? We don't know. I think the maximum pressure campaign that will take long is more likely to be the case than something else. But I think Dario's right. Venezuela has resources that Cuba simply doesn't have. And so the pressure that he will have to act on Cuba is far less than what he had in Venezuela. Yes, there's domestic interest, but they're not sufficient, I don't think, for a more immediate extraction or intervention, or however you want to call it. So I do think that if there's any action on the part of the U.S., I don't think it will be military in nature. I don't see American troops on the ground at all anytime soon. That's not the way he operates, and I don't think he sees a direct national interest, even though there's no question that Cuba does pose a direct interest to American security. Every leftist regime in the Western Hemisphere has been inspired for the past 67 years by the Cuban regime. There's no question about that. I think the question is, does that pose an imminent threat to the United States, so that if the U.S. doesn't act now, immediately, the situation will get a lot worse for the U.S.? And I think the answer is probably not. It's bad. It directly affects U.S. interests, but not immediately to act and to take the dictator out. So I do think you're right that this will probably be far longer than we would like it to be, and we have to look at it from the perspective of somebody, as I said, who was elected to represent American interests, not Cuban interests. As blunt as it might sound, I think that's the reality. Now, I do think that there's something else that is different from other crises that we have seen in Cuba. The Cuban regime has been incredibly resilient for the past 67 years and has been able to find somebody to pick up the tab. For decades, that was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed, and then within a matter of just a couple of years, it found Venezuela to pick up the tab. Venezuela is no longer picking up the tab, and I don't see anybody else doing so. The Chinese are not going to do it. The Russians are preoccupied. The Mexicans, for President Sheinbaum, I think has handled the U.S. relationship very well, and I think made her first strategic mistake in saying that Mexico will pick up the slack when it comes to oil, and within a matter of days, she reversed course and said that she wasn't going to do it. She's smart. She realizes that as much as she might be aligned ideologically with the Cuban regime, she needs the U.S. far more than she needs Cuba, and in a matter of months, she's going to have to renegotiate the USMCA, and it might be a revision or a complete renegotiation from scratch, and the latter is not something she wants. So Mexico's not going to pick up the tab. Nobody else in the Western Hemisphere will. So I think we do have a possibility in which finally nobody will pick up the tab, and the regime might collapse from within. And that is certainly a possibility, but again, I don't expect the U.S. to put boots on the ground. I don't expect the U.S. to act in the way that it acted with Venezuela. But given how bad the situation is, and given how nobody will pick up the tab, it might just collapse from within. And if that doesn't happen, then I think we're going to see a fairly long transition period. Anyway, just my 2 cents. Ellen?
Thank you, Carlos.
By way of background, I'm a journalist in many years, early trade. My former boss, Claudia Puig, is here from Univision, where I work. Thank you. So I worked in President Trump's first administration as Director of Media Affairs, and was also Governor DeSantis' first communications director as well. I think that if it hadn't been for the Trump administration, we wouldn't be talking about Cuba in these terms today, where we're talking about imminent change. Collapse, economic collapse, not new in Cuba. We always knew that was going to be, it's been an ongoing process. But we do see the Trump administration really calling out Cuba for what it is. It's a terrorist state that supports terrorism and supports all the enemies of the United States. It's done more to destabilize Latin America than any other country, and has been very efficient and effective in making sure that the developed nations that have supported it diplomatically through the United Nations and the Organization of American States and so have stopped and really reconsidered. And to your point, even in the case of Mexico, which has been a great ally of the Cuban regime, has taken a stand and stopped because they do need the United States today more than ever before. So you do see a change. Darío, I completely understand and agree with you on many levels with, the possible scenarios. There is something that is different that's going on today, for example, is that Mike Hammer from the State Department, who oversees Cuban affairs, is in Cuba taking videos of the provinces where he's built, and he's going there to deliver humanitarian aid to Cuba because of hurricane assistance. And he's taking videos in Holguín, for example. And I don't know that this would have been allowed some years back, regardless of, which administration was in power. But the Cuban regime's allowing that today. That tells you something. If they're not negotiating, they're really thinking about it, or at least stop poking the bear. And that, I think, is significant. I also do think that there are those who will continue to support the Cuban regime. Just today, the Congresswoman from Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, tweeted, labeling Cuba as a, quote, national security threat, unquote, is a lie used to justify economic war. The goal is to crush the Cuban people, manufacture a humanitarian catastrophe, and force regime change at any cost. It is unconscionable and cruel. We must stop it. The Cuban regime has had a lot of accomplices, certainly within the United States. There's no doubt about it. This woman gets elected into office every 2 years. It tells you something about what's happening here as well within the United States and our tolerance for totalitarianism. I think it's going to be a really interesting year. And for the Cuban people, I really do hope there's change. I don't know how you do it without regime change. I don't know how you fix Venezuela without regime change in Cuba. And I think if it hadn't been because Venezuela is such a rich nation in oil, and you have interests such as Chevron, we wouldn't be talking about Cuba in these very realistic terms, because you can't fix Venezuela if you don't fix Cuba as well.
Eduardo.
I've prepared some remarks because I knew the table would be a little imbalanced, and not just because of my height, but let me just say, why did Venezuela matter, right? And and why its loss is structural to Cuba. For more than 2 decades, really, Cuba has depended on Venezuela. And that relationship was strategic symbiosis. Venezuela subsidized oil. Cuba provided doctors, intelligence officers, security advisors, you name it. This was not aid, it was largely authoritarian codependence. And we know that went on throughout the region. The extraction of Maduro and the imposition of a co-governing structure in Venezuela effectively ended that relationship. For Havana, this is not a policy setback, it's a structural rupture. Okay? Oil flows have collapsed, payments for Cuban services are drying up, if they ever were. Cuba has lost its single most important external patron. Now, all of you know, who've studied Cuba for so many years, know that Cuba has always survived by substituting patrons. This time, as all of you have said, substitution appears implausible. The Chinese aren't there, the Russians aren't there. I think, Jorge, you forgot to mention that even the Algerians were providing some oil, but even the Algerians are gone. But I also want to stress that Cuba is not Venezuela. And I want to, I've heard a lot of these parallels. The temptation really is to assume that Cuba will follow the Venezuelan trajectory. And that analogy fails in several fundamental ways. Number one, as all of you have said, Venezuela has no oil. Cuba has, well, maybe Venezuela has no oil either, right? Because now it belongs to the United States. Cuba does not have oil. It has nickel and it has cobalt, and they matter, but they are insufficient to anchor the regime's survival the way oil will anchor Venezuela's survival. And the U.S. strategic intervention there will not go there for nickel or for cobalt, okay? The second great difference is regime type. For whatever it was, Venezuela, and this is academics, we always called it a competitive authoritarian regime, right? Why? Because it held elections. It lost elections, and it committed fraud to survive, right? It was still competitive authoritarian. That process did produce a mass opposition, and it produced figures like Maria Corina Machado. Now, I'm going to say some things that may sound insensitive. Cuba never took that path. It is still a centralized, I don't think it's a Marxist-Leninist regime because that doesn't exist. But there are no national elections the way there were in competitive regimes, right? There's no institutional opposition, and there's no legal mechanism for turnover. We know that. But the important thing is that in Cuba, there is no opposition, or there's an opposition with no capacity. It's either small, it's fragmented, it's under surveillance, it's imprisoned, or it's in exile. And it's neither capable of toppling the regime, nor is it capable of reconstructing Cuba in the aftermath. And that's important, okay? And your comment about there's no Delcy, right? There's no Delcy either within the regime, but we also have no Maria Corina, right, upon which to even think about an opposition, right? And I'm going to say some things about the exile community as well in a few minutes. Third, just about every morning when I was the director of the Latin American Center, I had a wonderful Cuban-American lady who would come in and tell me, this time, this week, se acabó, right? Fidel se cae, no? And I've been saying this in interviews as well. This is the worst crisis ever, right? How long have we been saying this? Dario enumerated this. Energy blackouts, food scarcity, currency collapse, mass migration. How long has that been going on? Forever. Okay? The loss of Venezuelan oil certainly is going to intensify this, but what we've been predicting, this imminent collapse, right? The reality is that for some reason, as you pointed out, Dario, these guys have an amazing capacity to survive, even under conditions where we thought, most of us thought that Cuba was going to collapse in the 90s. Here they are 30 years later, right? So the real question to me is not whether Cuba is in crisis, it's whether this time the buffers are gone. And I think they're gone, and they're largely gone because the geopolitical things that you were addressing are different. And so that new geopolitical context, that Trump 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, right? And the Monroe Doctrine, which is what you wanted me to talk about, or the Donroe Doctrine, right? It's no longer rhetorical. It's now operational, and that's a reality, okay? There's a U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean. Will the U.S. use it? I don't know. Will they need to use it? Probably not, okay? There are no Russian missiles. There's no Soviet-style umbrella. China lacks the will, or even, they're not going to intervene in Cuba to protect the Cubans, right? And international socialism is also dead, okay? So all of the underpinnings that Cuba had, right?
Tell our colleagues that. I'm just asking.
All right? So Cuba's external tools as well, medical diplomacy, sports trainers, intelligence networks, and what have you, those are all weakened, right? Yesterday, somebody was telling me there are still medical advisors in Bolivia. Most of you may know that I'm Bolivian. And I said, well, they're there, but they're probably going to stay there, right? Right? And looming over this context is our former colleague, Marco Rubio. He has been politically empowered after Venezuela. He's deeply committed to a hardline Cuba policy. And the vision of seeing a liberated Cuba, to me, is a pathway to 2028. Let's not forget this, okay? And I think that we always forget that international policy is local politics also, right? Local politics drives international policy. And I'll end here with a few comments on the exile community. Any serious discussion about Cuba's future has to address the role of the exile community, especially here in Miami. Now, this is a wealthy community. It's a politically organized diaspora. I heard a figure today that they can invest about $40 billion in Cuba. I don't know if that's true or not, okay? But I think we need some analytical sobriety here, right? First, the community is generationally divided, okay? And I've been documenting this more and more, right? There is a generational divide in this community that's important. Pre-2000 exiles tend to be wealthier, more ideologically cohesive, and politically mobilized, right? Post-2000 arrivals are worried about other things. They fleed economic collapse. They're still trying to make it here, right?
I make a comment.
When I finish, okay?
Okay.
All right. And let's,
Because it used to be 1990.
well, okay, but now it's 2000.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, cohesion matters. Large-scale reconstruction requires it, and it is in short supply, okay? And then I think it's important to look at the comparative experience. Across Eastern Europe, Martin is here, and Central America, exiles do help, but typically in secondary roles. They're connectors, they're human capital, they're niche investors. They do not carry the burden of national reconstruction. And Cuba's needs, as Jorge pointed them out, right? I mean, the needs that Cuba has dwarf any diaspora's capacity. And that, to me, is really the fundamental question here, and it's something that all of you have mentioned. The United States is not really willing to invest the kind of money that Cuba will require for infrastructural development, right? And that, to me, is, you're going to need a new energy grid, as we've been told, transportation, ports, housing, telecommunications, you name it. You need a Marshall Plan for Cuba. But I don't think the United States is ready to fund a Marshall Plan for anywhere, especially leading to the 2026 elections and then the 2028 elections. So can Cuba last this out is the real thing, right? And the honest answer is uncomfortable. Yes, the regime can survive, but only through deeper repression and continued mass emigration, right? And I think, Dario, that even its ability to repress today, as you noted, right, is not there. But there is no rapid transition. But the most likely scenario then in this sense, and it's the unfortunate one, given all, and I think that this is where we agree, that I think that 2 to 3 year scenario of continued deterioration is the most plausible scenario. So those of us who are thinking, of a scenario before the November elections, it's probably wishful thinking. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think you are shaking your head. You don't agree with.
I'm the non-political expert here at the table, but I do think there is a collapse. And I think the collapse is coming a lot sooner than all of you think. I'm talking about zero oil. I'm talking about the repressive police would not have gasoline to put in their cars to go and beat somebody up. Okay? Today they were emptying the hospitals. There's a sugar mill in Campechuela that doesn't have fuel for their machines that cut down sugar cane. They're looking for macheteros.
They're evacuating hotels.
They're looking for macheteros. So my collapse scenario from the energy and the oil point of view is that come April, March, late March, zero. Zero. And I'm not talking about the Cuban crude oil that goes into the electric power sector. I'm talking about jet fuel. I'm talking about gasoline. I'm talking about diesel. None. None whatsoever. Now, the rest of the experts on the table, what I want to know is what is the post-collapse scenario? That's my question. I don't know their business, but I can tell you my business, and my business says that the lights will go out. In Cuba, the biggest apagón that you have ever seen will happen sooner than any of you think. And now what? That's the question that I have for the rest of the
Yeah,
panel.
the question is, can a modern
Well,
society survive a complete collapse of the economy? Complete.
Cuba was last
Collapse.
modern in 1959.
Yes,
But,
we're now back to essentially early 20th century.
Yeah,
Oxes
but-
and horses and that kind of thing. But still,
But I think Eduardo's, I hate to admit it, Eduardo had a point in that, one.
1 point.
One point, and that is that the U.S. is not going to get Haiti, another Haiti. We don't need another failed state. So the question is, what is the role? The only comparative advantage that Cuba has is the exile community in Miami in terms of influencing American politics, and that's limited. I mean, it was more important 20 years ago when Florida was a swing state, and now it's not a swing state. So, Cuba is less important. One of the, and Marco cannot afford to be too Cuban if he wants to run for president. He can't look like he's favoring. It's like, it's the box that politicians are in. He cares deeply about Cuba. There's a sense of destiny, right? We have a Cuban-American Secretary of State, and there's a major political catastrophe happening in Cuba. But he has to be careful about, the MAGA Republican base that Carlos knows very well, and who view any international engagement with a great deal of, what did you say? Trump's job is to be president of the United States, not president of Cuba. So I think to answer your question directly, is Miami has to get his act together. I'm not so worried about the 1990 division or the 2000 division.
to do what?
To do what? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the act that Miami's going to get together in order to solve the collapse?
One is the investment into Cuba, the political pressure.
It's already moving.
Yeah, it's already moving, but well, it's finished, is the division within the community between different groups of the same generation.
But the big money is in the older generations, and those are the ones who are
but
invested.
But they're divided.
politically.
They're divided themselves.
I think we're exaggerating the division. According to our own Cuba poll,
Oh, okay.
according to our own Cuba poll,
No, but they're not.
the people who arrived most recently after the Obama experiment failed are registering into the Republican Party at more than 60%.
No, that's not.
That is not what
But aren't
Eduardo was saying.
we putting the
That's
cart
not the
before?
division I'm talking about. I'm talking about the division within the Cuban elites, the Cuban business community.
But aren't we putting the cart before the horse?
Yeah.
Who is the Cuban exile going to work with on the island,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I mean, that's the ultimate
fair question.
I mean, seems to me Unless, seems to me that the next leader of Cuba is in Cuba.
Oh, certainly.
We just don't know who that is.
Yeah.
We just have no idea. Nobody knows who that is. And that is one of the big question marks. If there is no foreign entity, as you suggested, that is going to come to the rescue of the regime, it's going to collapse, as Jorge says, March, April. That's it. And then an island where there is no connectivity for communications of the most basic kind is going to have to work together, reorganize to, I don't know, maybe through chits, elect a leader. It is that dire, it is that bad. I think that Marco Rubio is leading within the cabinet, the president's cabinet, this conversation brilliantly because he's aligning the conversation to what is in the best interest of the United States. A stable, strong, democratic Latin America with a strong, stable Caribbean is in the best interest of the United States.
But that,
But the road to that,
but that,
if I
that
can-
denies the premise of a 3-year collapse or three-year transition collapse. We want this to happen as fast as possible.
if
We
I-
don't want to wait 3 years because then the humanitarian crisis is going to force some sort of intervention by the United States. Because as Colin Powell said, if you break it, you own it.
if I may, and I may be cutting in front of Carlos, but let me, what's happening in the hemisphere right now is extraordinarily instructive, okay? The United States opted for a particular strategy in Venezuela, right? Sidelining the democratic opposition and deciding to co-govern with the regime, okay? That's a fact, it's not an opinion, okay? The plan is long-term. We don't know if it's 3 months, 6 months, 10 months, 10 years, okay? Why? Because Venezuela, like Cuba, has these enormous structural challenges because the regime destroyed Venezuela. And what it takes is massive amounts of investment, which probably the oil industry alone is not going to be able to suffice. Now, take that same analogy and let's look at Cuba, right? If we're going to lead Cuba to collapse, which, by the way, all 3 of our democratically elected representatives are saying no more remittances, no more, let's accelerate the collapse. Let's accelerate the humanitarian crisis. Let's accelerate a scenario. Let's make Cuba into Haiti. I had the privilege of working in Haiti for 6 years. I know what that's like. And Haiti still survives. Always you throw around these terms like failed states. You have to have a state before it fails.
Yeah.
Right? The problem in Cuba is that the only thing that, as Dario pointed out, that works is the repressive mechanism of the state,
The
right?
state.
Okay? But if we lead it to collapse, right, the rebuilding is going to be much more, how should I put it, painful. And that, frankly, with all of these, I think Ambassador Hammer has been going around distributing humanitarian aid. So we are, we have a concern here. But our politicians are saying we want even that to be cut off. So the scenario we're posing is a scenario of a complete humanitarian crisis in Haiti, in Cuba. And then we're saying, who's going to rescue it? And we're basically saying the Cuban exiles do not have the talent or the resources to do it in that context. We need something beyond that. So that's my concern, that we don't really know how far down Cuba can go before anybody is going to say enough and let's take it out of its misery. And I know this because every single day I've written op-eds out the wazoo about Haiti. It's time to stop the bleeding in Haiti. And nobody wants to help Haiti. Nobody. We put in a few pennies in there every once in a while, but nobody wants to help Haiti. That's what Cuba will become.
But we're assuming here that the current regime will continue to survive the complete collapse of the economy and the potential consequences of that, reverberations of that. Every communist totalitarian society that has collapsed because there was a break at the top. The reasons are different for each case, but there was always a break at the top. Can we imagine a break at the top in Cuba, or Cuba is exceptional even in that sense? It is exceptional in one thing. All the European cases of transition from communism to democracy, the party was in control and the military was subservient. In Cuba, it's the other way around.
Well, there's a couple of things going on, right, in Cuba. One is Raul's aging,
He's 94.
yeah. Either he's a vampire or he'll die eventually. The second is there is no white knight to come in and rescue them.
No.
And third, there's no immigration as a social leverage because of Trump's immigration policy. So the one threat that the regime had was, as we collapse, we have an immigration crisis. And now, where are they going to go? Brazil?
Well, we're deporting them.
What?
We're deporting Cubans.
Yeah.
Don't forget that.
Yeah, but the rate is very, very slow. We're talking about 1,600 people in 1 year. It's a very slow rate. There are, 1 million Cubans crossed the border in the last 5 years.
Yeah. So there is a lot of social tension. The question, if the regime sees April April 5th as the date that they better have something done, or they collapse, or are they just going to increase the repression as much as they can and hope, send the police out in bicycles? I don't know.
The first thing they will do, because it's instinctive, is to increase repression. In fact, my main concern right now is those dissidents who are still out in the streets. And yes, there is an opposition in Cuba. Like every other opposition in a totalitarian society, it's being systematically crushed, persecuted, incarcerated, and pushed out. But they're there. They are there. My concern is that the regime will go for them when things begin to get really bad. So again, we're all hinging here on what will the U.S. do? What will this administration is willing to do after saying Cuba is a threat and we're willing to force regime change? No boots on the ground, I agree. But no action like Venezuela? Why not?
I think the easiest one to do first is maximum pressure.
Yes.
Right? Because there's no risk.
That's where we are now.
Right? There's no risk. No, we're not a
Yeah, they're going to shut
What's
down.
going to be the result of maximum pressure?
Right.
Whatever. Let's not talk about what. But after maximum, what's? Give me an event.
Hopefully, the mindset, right? The logic is that it accelerates the collapse that you are predicting
From within.
and from within, and hopefully that creates the change. If you're not going to have it, if the regime is not willing to give up power and we're not willing to intervene, The only thing we can do, the only thing we might be willing to do, the farthest they might only go is maximum pressure. Could they go further? Yes. What will make them do that? That's the question.
Let's hear questions from the public to see if we can find a way out. Please, stand up.
Yeah. Well, the question is, I believe that there is a big problem in Cuba right now with the aging population. And there is a very difficult, besides all the situation that you mentioned, just to do that. I think I have one assumption is that at a certain point, Cuba will need to have certain kind of immigration just to replace, because also there is not only, there is aging population, it's the distribution of the population inside the island. If you look how the population has been redistributed in the island, many people are moving to the west side of the island. There are certain parts of the island that are completely empty at this point. And there is a huge problem, considering what is the basic situation from the economic point of view. I don't know what I would like to know. What is the... Go ahead.
You want to take a couple of questions and then?
Oh, now. My name is Pepin, and thank you very much. I think it has been extremely interesting, everything that you mentioned. One thing that I think I failed to listen, the importance geographically of Venezuela and Cuba. Cuba is 90 miles from this country. From day one, they have been spying, and we know that, to this country. Not only that, they have been instigating this country. And now China, I think you are aware, they have bases there that they're using to spy in the United States. So regardless of what resources we have, what we do to this country is more detrimental than any money that we can get from them. Venezuela, Iran is there, China is there, and if we allowed those countries to take control of those two places, we're going to be in a very bad shape.
Thank you. Thank you. One more.
Yeah. Well, you kind of paint a very bleak picture here as far as the future of Cuba. I look at it more optimistically. Also, with regard to the immigration policy, that's Trump's policy. Trump's not going to be here forever. And so in a few years from now, there might be another regime change here in the United States where they may open up immigration so that Cubans can come here. They're already here, but there's many that are not here. But my point here is that one of the options that we haven't really explored much is the fact that if the economy collapses, as you've indicated, given the fact of the lack of oil, and without oil, the economy comes to a complete stall. My question is that if there's a reset there, is there a climate in Cuba that would, putting aside the Cuban exile community in Miami, that as a matter of capitalism, as a matter of foreign investment of entrepreneurs here in the United States, to me, my impression is that they're drooling, waiting for the opportunity for Cuba to open up for business. Because I think there's a ton of money, trillions of dollars of money that could be infused into Cuba once the present regime is destroyed. And I don't believe, real fast, I don't believe that the political changes in Venezuela are going to last the test of time. By just pulling the weed and leaving the roots there, like Desi Rodriguez, nothing's ever going to change there. And quite frankly, I don't think the United States really cares there. But they do care about Cuba because Cuba is 90 miles away and they don't want a destabilized country, whether you call it failed or what have you, 90 miles from their border. So I'm just asking what your opinion is with regard to foreign investment.
Please, let's deal with these questions, and then we go to the next round.
Well, I think the demographic question is something that's underestimated. I mean, Cuba, even in the 1950s, had a elderly population. Oh, and Cuban Americans are more elderly than any other Latino group, and that carries on so one of the problems Cuba has is its workforce is here, literally, and so that's going to be one of the big obstacles in any Cuban recovery is the cheap labor, which is what, we're left with.
From an economic perspective, before you invest in any country, you want to have a semblance of rule of law. And one of the big issues that you have with oil companies, and I think, Jorge, you had mentioned it, that oil companies returning to Venezuela, is that they've been burned more than a couple of times, and how many times do you want to go back? The only country that had an economic embargo on Cuba has been the United States. Every other nation in the world has had the opportunity, and many have invested in Cuba and lost their shirts. Mm-hmm. Do you want to go back to that? And what guarantees? I mean, yes, there's money in the exile community, but
You don't want to lose it.
you want a fair return on your investment, to say the very least.
It's not even a question of return on investment. It's the Cuban American community is not going to invest in a country that is still controlled by the same people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we go back to you have to have a fundamental change, a cultural,
economic change comes
political,
after
economic
political
change that's going to be profound. And why is it when Cubans come 90 miles to the United States, they're extremely successful here, and their talent and brilliance shines?
He's been wanting to ask.
Wait.
Te traté.
My name is Uba de Aragon, and I want a question especially for Jorge. You seem to think, and I agree, that the collapse of the Cuban regime it's near, and I mean the economic collapse. I would like you to tell us what that's look like. How many people are going to die because there's no hospital care? How many older people won't get food that people used to send here, but the food, they don't have anybody to deliver it? How long can it last? And what would the regime do? Would they leave? Would they stay? How will humanitarian help come? How many people do we see going to have to see dying in Cuba before anything happens? Because I think that crisis is coming soon, and it's just not a word. It's people who are there, people I love, people I know, and I just want you to give us a picture of how that's going to look like and how long it will last and will happen. Because this is not speculating. These are people, real people who are there and are going to die.
Hello. Hello, my name is Leonie Diaz. I'm a student here at FIU studying international relations. I'm also a fellow with the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. I'm also representing the post-2000 immigration wave in the generational representation of the diaspora. I'm wondering, because I've seen a lot of Cuban organizations of the Cuban diaspora trying to organize a political movement within Cuba now for there to be a semblance of another July 11th on the island. And I believe the hope is that if there's another July 11th, maybe that would promote the Trump administration to have more kinetic energy. I'm wondering if the panel thinks if another July 11th does happen, would that actually promote the Trump administration to do anything different, maybe something more tactical or something different?
Will I get one more?
Yeah, quick. Nelson Oliva. I've heard a couple things, that you guys have said that were of interest to me. The first one that I thought was very interesting is I completely disagree with the theory that Cuba is another Haiti. The Cuban people are resourceful, and I think there's a different outcome in Cuba if something happens there. I strongly disagree with that theory. That's my opinion. The other thing is, it's a legitimate question, is I keep hearing over and over again about this purported pressure that would somehow, some way lead to some kind of change in Cuba or a collapse in Cuba. A collapse of what? A government that's been there for 6 or 7 years? How are they going to collapse? My question specifically is, what does the pressure look like from anybody that's up there that has said that? It's actually going to be, these people could last there another 100 years. I could get some military supplies and last in this room, 20 years. Those guys don't care. They'll run on generators in their house. They'll keep lighting their home, their mansions with solar panels. That's the reality. They don't care if the people in Cuba die. So my question isn't whether people in Cuba are going to keep dying. That's going to keep happening. My question is, what is, from somebody up there that's talked about this alleged pressure that we're going to give this government, who frankly doesn't give a rat's you-know-what about what's going to happen? They don't care. There's no pressure that they're ever going to react to. I don't know. I can't believe anybody even thinks that. So my question is, what's the pressure?
Why don't we each just respond to all the questions?
I just want to throw another number on the table. Thanks to Sebastian, I was able to have a conference call with some folks who asked us about 2 weeks ago to give them the value of the 60,000 barrels a day. We were asked to compute, to come up, if someone had to step in and buy 1 year's supply of oil products, how much money will be 1.7 billion. So in other words, if you want to keep the lights on, and you want to keep things the way they're today, someone has to buy in the market $1.7 billion of jet fuel, gasoline, diesel, and so on. The one thing that we didn't talk about is water. Water is another big trigger that's going to take place in Cuba, another pressure point for the Cubans. My question still hasn't been answered, which is, what is the post-collapse scenario looks like? We keep talking about a collapse. Am I that naive? All that I want to know is, I know Marcos Rubio, I know the whole politics about the United States. That's not what I'm asking, is what does the post-collapse scenario looks like? Is it troops on the ground? What does it look like?
I think the most important thing that we're left with tonight is that we don't know, right? There we go. Thanks. But Uva and this gentleman raise a very good point. If there is not a negotiated transition, if the U.S. is not willing to use military force, then what's going to happen is increase amount of economic pressure. And the economic pressure will look like no oil, no gasoline, right? The elites, you're right, they can wait that's why I originally said it might be a 2 or 3 year period, because these regimes have a tremendous capacity to let their people suffer, and that's going to come at a huge human cost. And there's no getting away from that. And that could be one of the scenarios, a huge humanitarian crisis.
Okay. One thing I am surprised is nobody talked about very much about what threat Cuba has been to the United States over the years. The small island that Ana Belén Montes, Cuban spy in the Defense Department for 20 years, saying, Cuba's small island, we don't have to worry about it. And then we have Rocha being the Cuban spy being for 40 years in the government and related issues.
If I may just briefly, I think one of the successes that we see for the restoration of democracy and rule of law in Latin America really comes from FIU to a great degree, and Adam Smith Center is one that I can tell you in the last 5 years, Carlos Diaz Rosillo has done a great job, as done other organizations and institutions here at FIU to have these type of forums, to meet with leadership in Latin America, throughout the hemisphere, and really focus. Adam Smith in Latin America, why not? And I think that's been a great success.
Thank you, Helen. Let me say something. By the way, I completely agree that the threat that this small island has posed to the world is huge. And for a great analysis, I'm going to make a plug by a book for a book that was Frank. Get up, Frank, in the back. 12 mitos sobre Cuba. We were going to publish in English. The 12th myth is precisely that. This small island is really not that powerful and doesn't do much. No, it's a great myth. However, when you're advising the President of the United States and you go into the Oval Office with your great plan to overthrow the Cuban government and to bring democracy to Cuba, and somebody cuts you because Iran is happening, or North Korea is happening, or China, or Russia, all of a sudden this threat that is very real goes down the list and down the list and down the list, because even though it is a threat, there's no question about it, it is not imminent like some of the other ones. And so for that reason, even though I don't think it's likely, but it is possible that one of the scenarios that you talked about earlier might happen, which is nothing happens. Again, I don't think that's likely to be a case with a high probability, because President Trump has said that Cuba is next. However, Helen, you said something very true, which is you said strong, stable, democratic hemisphere is in the best interest of the U.S. It is. And therefore, a strong, stable Cuba is in the best interest of the United States. However, thank you. However, an unstable Cuba is not in the best interest of the United States. And so a potential direct action on the part of the U.S. that could destabilize Cuba in the hopes that eventually it becomes democratic might be so unappealing that it's possible, unlikely, but possible, that the U.S. doesn't do much more than what it's doing. That it doesn't do much than continuing sanctions and say, you know what, we're going to focus on Venezuela right now, which is a bigger priority for a lot of individuals who want to invest and make a lot of money quickly. And so again, I don't think this is likely to be the case, but it's not to be discounted completely, because one possibility, as unappealing as it might be to us in this room, is that it doesn't do a whole lot more than what it's doing.
So very quickly, Eric De La Fuente, Senior Research Fellow at the Adam Smith Center and Adjunct Professor at the Green School. How do we think the Cuban government is thinking about using the $18 billion that they have in foreign reserves that have been publicized there on the one hand, and what levels or what tools do we have in the international community of maybe freezing, maybe preventing them from using it? Because they're definitely counting on that to try to survive, and that's been documented, the $18 billion.
That's a good question.
I'm Mayra Blanco Martinez. I'm a journalist, and I have 3 questions for you. The first of all, what was Cuba in 1951? Remember me, that was that Cuba. Is the same strategic geographic position of the island? And second question is, what it could be Cuba with the inversion from infrastructure, hotels, and the tourist reactive, an inversion of the whole war and the United States and the diaspora and everybody, like the queen of the tourists used to be. And the third question is humanitarian crisis. This is now. People is dying now. It's not going to happen because they pressure. People is dying now, and the crisis is now. Please, answer me the 3 questions. Thank you.
Sorry, last question. In terms of, Deborah Acosta, I'm a reporter. In terms of the post-collapse scenario, going back to that idea, what do we think about U.S. interests in terms of property seizure that happened after the Cuban Revolution? I didn't hear anybody. I'm a real estate reporter, so that's my focus. I don't know if anybody talked about property. Is that something that we've moved past? Is that likely to come in at all in the negotiations? I know Trump keeps talking about, wanting to get a better deal for the Cubans here in the U.S. I imagine property might be on his mind as a real estate developer that he is. So curious about that and whether we've moved past it, or is it going to be part of the conversation?
I don't think that's a priority for the administration at all. And even if it were, it's not something that they're going to be able to work out. I mean, if we're looking at a scenario that's anywhere from April to 3 years from now, who owns the property right now? Let's just say the property of Cuba belongs to the people of Cuba. And I think that's where you're just going to have to start from that ground level and understanding. There's a humanitarian crisis in Cuba today because of the Cuban government.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who can change it. The idea that the United States could come in and make that different, it's impossible without the Cuban government permitting it.
But Helen, if I can just, and this is my final comment. Eric, you said that there's $18 billion in reserves, right? And, at the highest level, when Bolivia had become this great natural gas exporter, and Evo Morales was the miracle, right? Bolivia had $15 billion of reserves, okay? After Evo left, they completely squandered that wealth, okay? And Bolivia has lived for 10 years on those $15 billion. Okay? So $18 billion can fund a lot. But the nature of the regime and the nature of where that money is such that it's not going to be spent on resolving the humanitarian crisis. Okay? So I imagine it's safely, placed somewhere else. So that, to me, is I think that the nature of these regimes is such is that they're willing to look at a humanitarian crisis leading to Haiti-like conditions. All right? I didn't say Cuba is Haiti. I said Haiti-like conditions. All right? And so they can survive for a long time on $18 billion, right? And I don't think that that's why this 3, 4, 5 year scenario is probably the most realistic given U.S. foreign policy priorities. Because right now, even the president has said it, right? We're expecting Cuba to implode. But if you have $18 billion, you can go a long way. Okay?
And yet they're allowing Mike Hammer, Ambassador Hammer, on the island, taking videos, showing him embracing the people of Cuba, giving them provisions. They wouldn't have done that. I mean, if this is occurring today and there are no plans to negotiate, then I don't understand what they're doing, because they're making the United States look good by providing this humanitarian aid through Catholic charities. And they're going to areas where normally you don't see cameras and you don't normally see reporters, that they just wouldn't be allowed anyway. And so it's just ironic, and that given that on the ground occurring with the Cuban government allowing it, that there isn't something bubbling underground. President Trump loves the art of the deal. He isn't really one to, he's always campaigned and he's anti-war. He would want to negotiate a deal in Cuba. It has been his pattern. And let's just hope it's the right deal.
It's almost 9.
I'm
going to take 2 more questions, and then we're going to close it.
Sebastian, before you do that, let me just say something, because I think and partly I'm to blame, is, we've gone to this very pessimistic route. But if you look at the history, and Eduardo will correct me if I'm wrong, but since I'm never wrong, uh, the but the but totalitarian regimes look all powerful until they're not. Right? There is always a moment where the regime can no longer either lost the heart to repress people. You can't get the guys on the bicycle to go beat up someone, right? Or the system collapses, something happens. It happened, no one expected the Berlin Wall to fall. No one expected Gorbachev to come out, right? So there is why Eduardo is right? El año que viene en La Habana, right? The famous New Year's Eve toast. At one point, we will be in Havana.
Okay, I have a question here.
Hello, Eduardo Blanco. I have a question. I think, I don't know if you agree or not, but isn't Raul Castro the one person that is holding back, a change in Cuba? Because I don't think anybody cares about Diaz-Canel or any other one person there. But there is some fanatism or castrismo that I think is all represented in Raul Castro. Isn't that the key maybe to, address that situation, that maybe Castro needs to go the way of Maduro or something like that?
Good question.
Yes. Carlos mentioned about the interests of the United States, and I'm thinking about the interest of Trump, because Eduardo also mentioned about how internal affairs are important on foreign affairs, right? So 10% of the total vote was Latino in 2024, 51% Democrat, 49% Republican. So the question would be, what would be the incidence on the Latino vote of a change of regime in Cuba in the next elections for Trump? And that's the interest of Trump, that all the polls says that is going down. So how that could play on the next elections? That's something that I think it's important.
I'll take that one. I think the impact will be close to zero. Cuban Americans care about what's happening in Cuba. Every other Latino group probably couldn't care less. 60% of Latinos are Mexican, who don't particularly care what's happening in Cuba. And so this will be an issue in Florida, but as Darío mentioned, right, it is no longer a swing state. So Cuban Americans could change their voting behavior, and Florida will remain a Republican state for the foreseeable future. So I don't think electorally having a free and there's many benefits to having a free and democratic Cuba, but elections in the U.S. is probably not one of them.
But I think that question has other dimensions to it, Carlos, and that is, I think you're absolutely right. On the national stage, it won't make any difference.
Yeah, I'm talking about the national stage.
But on the local stage,
Yes.
right, then I think that's where it becomes interesting, right? And,
Local.
Locally,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Let me make a comment. I think the Raul Castro observation is very astute. I think that opaque as the Cuban decision-making system is, everybody's still afraid of Raul. And if Raul leaves the picture, who knows what will happen. And I think maybe that would be a place where there might be some fracturing of the regime, where you will have different factions, where the military will but I think one of the great curses of the Cuban people is the longevity of the Castro family.
I think we have reached the end of the program, but I need to make a commercial before I close. The Institute of Cuban Studies is having a two-day conference coming up on 26th, 27th of February here on campus, where we are going to discuss what Cuba should look like the day after. Not what's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but the day after once it happens. And I have 22 panels of people who have been thinking about this for years. And if you're interested in listening on a more optimistic note about what the reconstruction of Cuba will take, I invite you to come.
No, that's
February 26th and 27th. Let's give a hand to our panel.
because I attended a seminar in the summer.
Thank you very, very much, and have a great evening.